afternoon, good evening, students. I hope you're doing good. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to carry on with another lecture concerning literature. Literature for third year students. As usual, last time we dealt with Romanticism as a movement. We have given its definition and its characteristics. Then we moved to the critiques of that movement. Then today, as you can see, we are going to take a sample, or we are going to take a poem that is related to that movement or that belongs to that movement, written by William Wordsworth, as you all know him, I suppose. He wrote a very beautiful poem called The Inward Eye, or also known under the name of I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. So we are going to try to understand the poem. We are going to analyze it. But we're not going to analyze it, let's say, randomly, but we are going to follow some specific steps that I'd like to start with. So before we analyze or even read and understand the poem, we are going to try to know or to get familiar with the steps that we need to follow in order to analyze any given poem. So that's the first point of the lecture. We are going to start with the steps to follow. We are going to explain the steps. Then we are going to read the poem and explain it. Then we are going to apply the steps in order to analyze it, and then we compare between the characteristics of the movement and the poem itself. So before I start, please leave a like on the Facebook page of this channel in order to be notified whenever I post something new, and also subscribe to the channel if it's not already done. That would encourage me to do more and also help you out during the exam period, of course. The first step to follow in order to analyze a poem is to determine the subject of the poem. How do we do that? We either paraphrase or summarize the poem. We need to know what is it about. We need to give the topic. In order to do that, you need to read the poem first, understand it, and summarize it on a draft, and then you understand the topic. The second point of this first step is to know or to identify whether the poem is a social, psychological, historical, or even a mythical phenomenon. This is very important. The second step is to identify whether or to identify the poem's narrator. How do we do that? We need to know who is speaking, to whom, and under what circumstances. Circumstances meaning to identify the setting. A setting is, let's say, the space, time in general, and some minor details concerning that. Once you have identified the narrator, you need to get familiar with the diction that is used in the poem by the poet, of course. So if or in case you have unfamiliar words, make sure to understand them, and of course you can look them up in the dictionary, and you need to understand what are the things that were explicitly told in the poem, of course, and what are the things that the reader needs to understand, let's say, implicitly. As you should know whether the words, or let's say most of the words in the poem, are concrete or abstract, whether the poet is exposing an idea or a notion that is abstract, or he is trying to describe something concrete, such as mountains in the case of romantics. So this is a difference between concrete and abstract. So is the poem free of cliches? What do we mean by cliche? It means sometimes poets tend to write about the same thing over the years or over a specific period of time. So people are getting tired of reading the same thing but differently. So you need to identify whether it is something original or authentic or not. So the last point of the diction step, you need to know how does diction contribute to attract to the poem or to detract the reader from the poem. This is very important. Some of the poets, they use a specific kind of diction that pleases the reader, for example. So Here the poet is making sure to attract the reader's attention. Sometimes we use a specific kind of diction which leads to a detraction from the poem. Then the fourth step is to determine the tone of the poem. This is very important. So we need to know that we have different kind of tones. For example, the tone can be serious, can be ironic, can be satiric, or contemplative. This is very important. Or even ambiguous. So contemplative means something or someone who adores nature, generally meditation, someone who praises everything that is found in nature, of course. So you need to, once you have identified the tone, and by the way, the tone is, let's say, the feelings that you feel when you read a literary text, or in our case here, a poem. This is the tone. Once you have identified the tone, you need to justify your answer. You need to give some words that are found on the poem that justify your answer. Then, of course, you need to determine whether the tone changes within the poem, because some poets might start with something that is related to grief, sadness, then end with let's say happiness, joy, or it's the opposite. It can start with happiness and joy and ends with grief and sadness. Or you can have a mixture of different tones, but you have to point them out. This is very important. Then let's say to round off with these steps, the last one is to determine the rhythmical devices used by the poet. We need to know what is the metrical pattern, the length of the line, and the length of the stanza in general, and what is the rhyme scheme, and does the poet employ any other metrical devices. This is the one that I'm going to discuss on this video, the metrical devices, and what form does the poem take, open or closed. For closed forms, or let's say closed form poems, are written in specific patterns, right? So using meta, line length, and line groupings that we call stanzas. And open form poems often usually on let's say they refer to a free verse poems, and usually do not use regular rhythmic patterns. And of course there are some other differences. Now we are going to move to the poem. So these are the steps that you need to follow. Now we move to the poem itself, to read it, explain it, and analyze it later on. The title is The Inward Eye. This poem, written by William Wordsworth, has or contains 4 stanzas, and each stanza has 6 lines. So in order to explain it, we are going to read each stanza alone and we explain it in parallel. Then we move to the next one. So the first one goes like this. I wandered, lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. He, the poet, was walking without a specific destination. This is the meaning of the word wandering, with an A and not an O. So he was walking without a specific destination, feeling a bit lonely, like a cloud, he said, and he saw a group of daffodils beside the lake under the trees, hovering or dancing in the breeze. So these daffodils were inside or beside a lake, beneath the trees, and they were dancing on the water. Then the second stanza goes like this. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in a never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. Here, the poet is comparing the daffodils to the stars that shine on the Milky Way. The Milky Way is the galaxy that Earth is situated in. And he added, they stretched in never-ending line, meaning they made a long line, also meaning there were so many. He added, 10,000 saw I at a glance. So he said that, meaning a quick look made him see 10,000 daffodils. He added, tossing their heads in a sprightly dance. He gave them a, let's say, human trait, tossing their heads, meaning they were dancing and they were moving their heads forward and backward or left and right. The third stanza says, the waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. Here he compared the dancing of both daffodils and the waves, and he said that daffodils danced better than the waves. And he also added how much joy that this view has brought into the heart of the poet. Last one says, for oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Here he is saying that later on, for many times, whenever he's laying down on his couch, for example, and he's thinking about many things, the view, or let's say the scene, comes back to his memory, that is the inward eye, and it brings joy, pleasure into his heart, and he also added that his heart dances with daffodils. So this is the explanation quickly of the inward eye, or the poem of William Wordsworth. Now we are going to move to the analysis. So what is it about? It is about the white flowers that we call daffodils, and express a deep feeling and emotions of the poet here. This is what it's about. So who is speaking? The poet, of course, William Wordsworth. To whom? To the reader, to us. And the setting is easy. You can imagine it if you don't have a concrete background of the poet or the social situation of the poet. That is William Wordsworth. You can say that he was in a forest or in the wilderness, and let's say he was wandering alone in the nature, and then he saw a lake, and in which he found these daffodils. So you can imagine things. So for the unfamiliar words in the dictionary, we can explain some of them, such as vacant. Vacant meaning emptiness, and jocund, cheerful, a high level of happiness, sparkling, that is shining, and the bliss, of course, it's immense and great joy as well. So these are quick examples about the words that can be a little bit complicated in the poem, and of course the words are mainly generally concrete, such as let's say daffodils, trees, lakes. So these things that we can actually see. But he also added something like the inward eye, there is the memory, we do not see it. So this is abstract, and also solitude. All these are abstract notions. So the diction contributes to attract, let's say, readers, because it has a unique kind of vocabulary or diction. He uses many adjectives, beautiful adjectives, not let's say not the opposite. So He spoke about the sparkling waves. He spoke about the twinkling stars, the dancing, the way the daffodils danced, and happiness, pleasure. So all this contributed to attract readers to the poem. And of course, to determine the tone of the poem is very important. Uh, the tone is contemplative, because see, William Wordsworth belongs to the movement that we call Romanticism, and they are in love with nature. So he's speaking about something related to nature. So everything that is related to nature and someone likes it, or nature for them is peaceful. It brings peace and pleasure. So we say that it is contemplative. Of course, words that set the tone, words like sparkling waves, or the fact that these waves had brought joy to the poet. So all these, let's say, support the claim of the fact that the poem is contemplative. Of course, then we move to, let's say, whether the tone changes within the poem. Here it depends on how people, let's say, interpreted the poem. Some of us might interpret that it started with solitude. The man or the poet was wandering alone, then he mentioned lonely, and at the end he also mentioned solitude. So, but most of the poem speaks about the joy that the daffodils had brought to the poet. So we are going to stick with that, but it is a debatable tone that some of us might feel and others might not. And at the end, we are going to talk about the literary devices. So I'm going to give 6 or 7, maybe 7 literary devices. I'm going to explain them and also exemplify from the poem. So the literary devices are used to bring richness and clarity to the text. The writers use them to make their texts appealing and meaningful. Wordsworth has also made the poem deeper and richer by using these devices, of course. We can find, for example, a simile. A simile is a device used to compare one object to another to help readers understand or clarify the meaning, using, for example, as or like. There are 2 similes used in this poem. The first one is, I wandered lonely as a cloud. So here he compares his loneliness with a single cloud. The second is used in the opening line of the second stanza, of course. He said, continuous as the stars that shine. So here we have as is the device. The second literary device is personification. As we all know, personification is to attribute human characteristics to lifeless objects. So we have an object, we attribute some human characteristics or some human traits to that object. The poet has personified daffodils in the third line of the poem, such as, when all at once I saw a crowd. The crowd shows the number of daffodils. The second example of personification that we can find is used in the second stanza as tossing their heads and sprightly dance. This is the best example that you can get. Tossing their heads, there are only human beings that can toss their heads. It shows that, of course, daffodils are humans that can dance, toss their heads, and of course the last example that I can give you is in a jocund company. Here is the poet considered the daffodils as his buoyant company. So something that brings joy, right? So normally only people bring joy when we say company. We're talking about humans. Then we move to the third literary device, that is alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of the same consonant sounds in the same lines of poetry, such as the use of g sound in I gazed and gazed, or the sound w in what wealth. So the same consonant is repeated. Then we have assonance. Assonance is the repetition. It's the same concept, but instead of consonants, we have vowel sounds in the same line, such as the sound of in 10,000 I saw at a glance. So here we say that the sound is repeated twice, at and the article glance. The next literary device is consonance. Consonance is a repetition of consonant sounds, such as the sound of t in what and wealth. The show to me had brought. And consonance, the difference between consonance and alliteration, is the fact that these sounds can be repeated either at the end or at the middle, right? And we move to the next literary device, is the metaphor. So Wordsworth has used one metaphor in the poem in the last stanza as they flash up in that inward eye. Here, inward eye represents the memory of, or the sweet memory of, daffodils. Then the last one is imagery. The use of imagery makes a reader visualize the writer's feelings and emotions. When you're describing it that way, the reader is, let's say, visualizing, and he understands better the feelings of emotions. So Wordsworth has used images appealing to the sense of sight, such as lonely as a cloud, or a crowd, never-ending line. So these things are, let's say, we can see them. And of course, these descriptions help the reader to imagine or feel the same joy felt by the speaker, that is William Wordsworth. I know this video is a little bit long, but it is rich of information, especially in terms of literary devices that are very important in order to analyze a poem, any given poem. And I wanted to complete the let's say the chapter of Romanticism. We cannot give only the theory. We cannot talk about the characteristics, and we do not know how to apply them on something that was written in that movement. So this video was to complete that, and I hope I made it clear to you. If it is the case, that's more like it. If you have questions, feel free to message me or even ask in the comments below. Leave a like on the Facebook page of this channel, subscribe if it's not done, share with your friends, share with your classmates, and I tell you, see you in the next video. Peace.